Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tom Simchak. I'm ESA's Director of Research and Programs. Thank you for attending today's webinar on energy storage tariffs in the U.S.-China trade dispute. This webinar is being recorded and will be available in the members section of energystorage.org. Questions can be submitted at any time throughout the webinar via the chat box in your browser, and we'll come to those after our two speakers. Following the webinar, you'll receive a very brief survey regarding today's topic and topics for future webinars. Your feedback ensures that ESA continues to provide the highest value information to you and your organization, so we really do value that feedback. Let us know what you'd like to hear about in webinars later this year. All meetings and teleconferences of the Energy Storage Association are held in accordance with our antitrust guidelines. We ask that you abide by these guidelines during today's webinar. The full guidelines are available in the members area of the ESA website. If you're not yet an ESA member and would like more information, you can reach out to my colleague Richie O'Neill. Membership includes free access to webinars like this one, among numerous other benefits, so please reach out for more information. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a brief update on upcoming ESA events. Registration is now open for the 2019 ESA Storage Exchange, which is October 15th and 16th in Bellevue, Washington. Storage Exchange is an event designed to examine the steps necessary to successfully integrate an energy storage project and evaluate the different ways companies are deploying storage to lower costs, reduce emissions, and establish a more resilient electric grid. We have a call for poster abstracts open too. You'll find registration, poster proposal submission guidelines, an agenda, and more information about that at the web address on your screen, energystorage-events.org. We also have a packed webinar schedule coming up, which you can find at energystorage.org, where there's a listing down the lower right of our main page. Next up, on June 12th, we'll be hosting the analysts from Wood Mackenzie, Power Renewables, for our quarterly energy storage market monitor webinar. That's one that's exclusive to ESA members. They'll be briefing members on the latest market data for energy storage, and the exciting news that Q1 2019 broke the record for megawatts deployed in a single quarter. So more good news in the energy storage world you can hear about next week. And many more webinars to follow, both for members and some available free to non-members as well. So keep an eye on the events lists on both the front page of energystorage.org and in the members-only section of the website. Today, we'll be looking at some of the impacts of the tariffs on Chinese batteries, which are we see all over the news at the moment. Hearing from John Magnus, who is president from TradeWinds LLC, and then we'll hear from Yayoi Sakine, energy storage analyst at Bloomberg NEF. After Yayoi's remarks, we'll open up to audience Q&A. You can ask questions via the chat box at any time, and we'll read those out for the presenters when we get to the Q&A session at the end. So thank you for attending today's webinar, and I will turn it over to John.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everybody. If there's any trouble hearing me, please send a distress signal through some way that word will get to me, and I'll try to improve the link on my end. I'm very grateful to have been included this afternoon. I have probably about 10 or 11 minutes of points to present to stir the pot and get the issues framed up a little bit and review what's going on with respect to tariffs on the supply chain for the energy storage industry. I am not connected in any formal way with the ESA, but I do a fair bit of work related to trade issues in the solar energy industry, as well as a number of others, and I've been a consultant and lawyer working in the trade field now for just coming on to 30 years. So I'll dive in here. The organization of this slide deck is pretty straightforward. There's sort of a quick look at all of the unusual tariffs and tariff threats that are currently noticeable in the U.S. trade regime. Most of what I'll have to say focuses on the China Section 301 proceeding. In case it's helpful to compare that to some of the other Trump tariff measures, I have a couple of slides on those, and also a slide on sort of other things that are happening in the trade agenda that provide some of the context for the public conversation around the China 301 proceeding. And then Q&A, I guess, won't follow immediately, but at the end of the second presentation. So just very briefly, the use of trade tools by this administration is not like the use of trade tools by prior ones. And this is a miniature list of unusual tariffs and tariff threats that are visible today. There are tariffs being deployed under Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Act, which provides authority for the president to adjust imports that are found to threaten national security. At the moment, there are measures in place on steel and aluminum. There are threatened Section 232 tariffs in the automotive sector and investigations going on in a couple of others. Section 201 is the safeguard law of the United States. People who have done some reading in the trade area may also have heard that referred to as the escape clause. Those safeguard measures have been part of U.S. trade history, but not part of current U.S. trade policy for a few decades. But they're enjoying a little bit of a renaissance right now, and there are a couple of safeguard measures in place. Section 301, that's the one that involves a proposal at the moment to impose tariff on lithium-ion batteries from China. And then the very newest one, which I added to this list, but I won't go into detail unless there are questions, is tariffs under IEEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, which were just announced last week as a way of pressuring Mexico to do something more than it's currently doing to stem immigration flows coming from its south and across our southern border. So that's sort of the overview. The Section 301 proceeding, I know, is the one of liveliest interest to this group. There are some underlying acts, policies, and practices of the government of China that have been called out. They tend to involve technology and IP, forced technology transfer, infringement of intellectual property rights, inadequate enforcement of intellectual property rights, all generally under the heading of China's effort to compete with and in many important areas overtake the United States in what both governments seem to agree are the industries of the future. The United States government has responded in a number of different ways. It did an investigation, made some findings about the objectionable acts, policies, and practices, and issued an affirmative determination under Section 301, which empowered the president to do quite a wide variety of things. I'll come back to the breadth of that authority in a minute, among which are 4 lists of tariffs. List 1, which went into effect last July, $34 billion worth of imported products from China. The numbers there refer to the annual value of the affected trade flows. List 2, another $16 billion worth of imports from China. Those tariffs have been in effect since mid-August, late August last year. List 3 tariffs went into effect in September, currently hovering at 10%, but could increase to 25%. If the negotiations going on between the two governments don't bear some fruit. And then list 4, which is commonly known as the everything else list, which is about another $300 billion worth of annual imports from China. Those tariffs are now in proposed form, and that list includes lithium-ion batteries trading under HTS 8507-6000. There have been exclusion processes related to lists 1 and 2. The lists themselves identify affected products at the 8-digit level in the tariff code. The exclusion processes, by and large, operate at the 10-digit level, and so they allow for certain smaller baskets of the stuff that's included at the 8-digit level to be let off the hook. The expectation is that there will be an exclusion list related to List 3 if List 3 goes into force, and likewise with List 4 if List 4 goes into force. The response of the U.S. government has not been limited to tariffs. The authority provided by Section 301 is unbelievably broad, and it basically allows the president and his designee, the USTR, to do a whole lot of things that otherwise would be strapped down very tightly in a legal system like ours, if they have published an affirmative determination in the Federal Register, which they've done in this case. So in the China case, the measures taken or threatened include, beyond tariffs, investment restrictions, increased export regulation on dual-use goods that folks want to send to China, and also taking some claims into the WTO dispute settlement process. And China has responded in kind, although at a lower level, with retaliatory tariffs since the United States put it in place. Now, peering forward, the trajectory, the two governments have been involved. If anybody reads the news ever, you've read something about this. But those negotiations right now are in a stalled state, and there's a lot of recrimination going on with respect to who sort of pulled the rug out from under what looked like a result that was coming together a couple of weeks ago, and who backtracked and why. The discussion is not limited at this point to the Chinese government acts, policies, and practices that were identified in the 301 findings that the USTR published. And instead, it includes a wide range of other things in the bilateral trade agenda that the U.S. government would like to solve in one way or another, and some things that the Chinese government would like to solve in one way or another. Among other things, it's expected that a deal, if one comes together, will simply include sort of a buying spree by the Chinese side, a lot of sort of headline purchases of stuff that they can say they otherwise would not have been buying, in sort of an effort to create good faith and goodwill. But other issues are bundled up in that as well, and apparently even including some national security type stuff like what's been going on with Huawei and similar issues. Not entirely clear what the U.S. government is trying to achieve. There is a lot of speculation that maybe what the U.S. government really wants is just a divorce, just a decoupling of the Chinese and U.S. economies. Also some evidence that they really do want a deal, but that their requirements are pretty high. Certainly a lot of focus on the enforcement aspects of the deal. They want to see changes at the legislative level in China, which has produced a lot of problems. They want to have the ability to make unilateral judgments about whether China is complying with the terms of a deal and snap the tariffs back if that turns out not to be the case. That's a problem in the negotiation as well. So it's in a bad state right now, and the current procedural posture is that they haven't really figured out how to get off the square that they find themselves on and schedule the next round of meetings. There isn't really a situation right now that would be conducive to folks at the working level regathering, and because some bigger picture political issues are not sorted out. With that being the case, the list 3 tariffs could be lifted 25% by the U.S. side. If that happens, the expectation is that an exclusion process will be launched at that point, and that it will work more or less like it worked with lists 1 and 2. The list 4 tariffs are going through public comment. There are key dates coming up. You'll hear about those in the next presentation as well. June 10th is one date for public comment, and then a hearing that USTR will organize for testimony and public comment. A lot of folks who see their stuff on this list 4 are trying to get it taken off of list 4 at the 8-digit level. Based on what's happened so far, my sense is that removals that do not get achieved at the 8-digit level are going to be very hard to pull off through the exclusion process at the 10-digit level if it ever comes to that. So the time to really bring the lithium-ion battery issue into focus is more now than later.
John,
those of you who are involved, yep.
Very briefly, could you just, as an aside, quickly summarize what 8-digit and 10-digit codes are for folks?
Yeah, sure. So everything that trades internationally is classified somewhere in the tariff schedule. The tariff schedule is harmonized up to the first 6 digits. It sort of describes, goods in an increasingly specific way as you go out to the 2nd, 4th, 6th, 8th, and 10th digits. Beyond 6 digits, at the 8 and 10-digit level, those classifications are not harmonized, and so the ones we have in our tariff schedule are unique to the United States. At the 10-digit level, those are known as statistical breakouts because we don't in our applied tariff, we don't sort of differentiate beyond the 8-digit level. So lithium-ion batteries, as an example, are in the tariff schedule at 8507-6000, and then within that, at the 10-digit level, there are two breakouts, one of which is for vehicle batteries, and one of which is for other lithium-ion batteries. Tom,
so any commercial, yeah, I think so. To summarize, if any industrial or commercial product would have a number, and the longer the number, the more specific is the reference to a particular product, correct?
Yes, but all lithium-ion batteries move under the 8-digit category, and some of them move under the 10-digit category for vehicle batteries, and all the rest move under the 10-digit category for non-vehicle lithium-ion batteries.
Great, thank you.
And those classifications beyond the 6th digit are unique to the United States. There's no necessary reason why someone else's tariff schedule would handle that level of detail in the same way. So not an encouraging report on the, why didn't that move? So now somehow, there we go. Just very briefly, in case it's helpful for comparison, and happy certainly to field questions on this in the Q&A, but here's a slide on another category of Trump tariffs. These are the ones imposed under Section 232 based on national security rationale. As I mentioned, steel and aluminum are subject to it right now. Those tariffs have been in place for quite a while and have triggered retaliation by a range of trading partners. In principle, those measures are global, unlike the 301 case, which is just about China. There's been a lot of difficulty administering these Section 232 measures. This is a category of U.S. trade remedy measure that was not in use really at all prior to this administration. But they have country exclusion processes and product exclusion processes, and those have been a little bit chaotic, although they seem to be working a little bit more smoothly now. The Section 232 findings on autos and automotive parts have been made, but the President hasn't announced any action yet, but he certainly has aggressively threatened it, and that would hit an amount of trade that greatly exceeds what has already been hit for steel and aluminum, and substantially complicate what's already a pretty complicated picture with our major trading partners around the world, particularly including Europe and Japan and our NAFTA partners as well. And then also for comparison, there are tariffs in place under Section 201, that's the safeguard law. Two cases that reached final decisions and implementation of safeguard measures last year, both of which are nearing the midpoint for their midterm reviews, one on solar equipment, one on washing machines. Those have also triggered negative responses from our trading partners, and also the administration's willingness to award relief, which is something that is uncommon, historically speaking, has created a little bit of an invitation for the filing of more safeguard petitions. So that seems to be coming as well. And then lastly, just sort of a little bit on the context, there's sort of elements of the trade agenda in the United States that are sort of steady over time, and then at the moment there's a bunch of stuff in the trade agenda that isn't typical at all. The NAFTA has been renegotiated, and there is now in focus the need to implement the results of that renegotiation legislatively. Pretty complicated here, possibly also complicated in Canada and Mexico, and more complicated now that we've announced retaliatory tariffs or national security-based tariffs on Mexican products kicking in principle next Monday. It's also uncommon that we have really no other free trade agreement negotiations going on. In the ordinary course of events, the evolution of the United States trade policy and trade regime is largely sort of prompted and shaped by the need to implement newly negotiated deals. And that's just not happening at all right now. And so that doesn't mean the trade regime sits still. That just means that other factors shape and prompt its development. And those other factors may not point toward a more liberal trade policy, but often towards a more illiberal trade policy. The pressure tactics that the United States government is deploying with respect to the World Trade Organization, that's something new. can answer questions about that if anybody has any. The administration of the trade remedy laws seems to be inviting a heavier than usual caseload. And the latest step that the administration took in that respect was to announce the analytical methods that it would apply if anybody comes in with new cases alleging currency subsidies. That has the potential to trigger more filings than we've seen previously, particularly with respect to goods from China. There's a broader fusion, and the IEEPA-based tariffs on Mexico are an example of it, of trade policy with national security policy. Those operated in a more independent way in the past. And so much so that there is now some interest developing on Capitol Hill to try to sort of write a new code of rules on the allocation of responsibility between the legislature and the executive branch when it comes to applied U.S. Trade policies, especially tariffs. I don't get the sense that Congress is ready to do anything like that right now, but they're more motivated in that regard than they've been in recent memory. And that motivation will increase more if the tariffs on Mexico go into place and if the tariffs on autos under 232 go into place. That's the end of my slide deck. There's contact information here, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thanks so much, John. That was very interesting. As a reminder to everyone, you can submit questions in the chat box, and we'll put your questions to our presenters at the end. And now we turn to Yayoi Sakine, an energy storage analyst at Bloomberg NEF. Yayoi, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for your presentation. It's actually so helpful to get the background on all this trade mess that's going on in the U.S. at the moment. My presentation, I guess, and before I just kick off with my section, I'd like to just give us a sense of the fact that I sit in the energy storage team, and Bloomberg NEF actually covers a significant array of different sectors around advanced transport, commodities, advanced materials, and digital industry. And so we do research in other areas. And part of what I do as an analyst here is to collaborate with the other sectors, and I'll talk to kind of where EVs fit in this mix and why it's so important to understand and contextualize technology, looking at other sectors as well. So just a quick plug-in to just say we do more, and I'm kind of looking specifically today at the impact of the 301 tariffs on the U.S. storage space. So in terms of the content, I'll probably whiz through the first slide around the Section 301 impact on lithium, or the Section 301 on lithium-ion batteries. I'll talk a little bit more in depth on the potential cost impact on storage systems, what are some of the supply and demand challenges, and kind of wrap it up around the impact on the U.S. energy storage sector. So just to kick off, I think this has been covered by John's presentation, but essentially the reason why we're looking at this now and why it's important is because it's going to hit the portion of the energy storage system which has the greatest cost impact on the total system cost. And so in May 17th, when the USTR, U.S. Trade Representative, issued the request for comments for additional tariffs, that included the 25% proposed tariff on lithium-ion batteries. Basically, by June 10th, you have to submit written comments. June 17th is the deadline when the committee will hold a public hearing for U.S. At the U.S. International Trade Commission. And then 7 days after that, that's the due date for submission of post-hearing rebuttal comments. So it's a pretty tight timeline. It means it's probably going to be a pretty busy summer, but hopefully we can kind of start to make sense of what's going on and how that will impact our sector. And so what I'll do in the coming slides is to try to break down at a high level on how this will impact the system costs. And I'll caveat this just to say the costs that I'll be presenting here are based on our global benchmark costs. So bear with me. It's to give a sense of the scale of the impact, but not necessarily to say specifically this is how your project will be impacted. Every project is different. But with that caveat in mind, I guess I'll move on to the first slide on the costs. So here, I think the main thing to consider is the battery rack is one of many components of a storage system cost. And so what you see there is essentially the blue bar represents, I guess, the the specific component cost. The red additional stacked bar is the impact of the 25% tariff on that particular component, in this case, the battery rack. So this is assuming that there's a 25% tariff on the storage system. And this is an illustrative 2019 general energy storage system for a 4-hour duration battery at utility scale. So here what we're saying is for a battery rack that has about the battery portion or the battery rack portion is about $188 per kilowatt hour. A 25% tariff would add about $47 per kilowatt hour, almost 50. And that, in terms of the total system cost, doesn't equate to a 25% increase in system cost. It equates to about 13% because it's about a third or 2/3 of the total system cost. But as I think the reason why the tariffs are still significant, 13% is a lot, 25% is a lot. And if you think about, I guess, just generally the stacks, the blue bars in this chart, clearly the battery portion is the biggest portion. And so that's why probably that's where we're going to spend the bulk of the time. But to contextualize, obviously batteries are just one form of a very long value chain or supply chain, which entails everything from kind of the products on the right side all the way up to kind of the raw materials. So think about metals, the components, which are basically anode, cathode, electrolytes that go into the cells, and then the cells and the packs and racks that are integrated into the product. And other components are already affected or potentially could be affected by the tariffs as well. And so when we look at what's already been affected and how the supply chain has already been disrupted, we've already seen tariffs being imposed at, I guess, 25% for some of the key metals in batteries, so lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, copper, all are core metals. For batteries, lithium-ion batteries are proposed at 25%. Other components, I guess on the product side, inverters from China are also tariffed at 25%. And so when we're starting to add to the stack of how these costs can basically be stacked up on the tariff side, you can see that it's not just an impact on the battery prices, it's just the whole supply chain being disrupted. And just to give some context, on this slide, on basically looking at the lithium-ion battery and looking at basically if you went further upstream and not just look at the battery rack, and you wanted to break down further to maybe circumvent the tariff by importing cells, for example. Cell materials and pack materials are about 2/3 of the cost of batteries, and so potentially you could be looking at targeting those and going further upstream if you wanted to just incur 25% on a smaller proportion of the battery rather than the full rack. So that's something that's, I think, some people are starting to think about in a way that probably you didn't really have to think about in the past. But just to keep in mind, like battery racks are just a component of a larger value chain. And then looking more specifically at how tariffs may or are impacting other component costs. Again, this is assuming that component is imported from China. PCS for utility scale generally might not be imported from China. They're either sourced within the U.S. or imported from other locations. But say a 25% impact on the PCS would actually only incur a 1% additional total system cost. If you look at kind of the balance of systems, so if you're looking at containers and additional components, 25% again incurs a 3% addition on the system cost. So again, not too much, especially not in comparison to the battery portion. In aggregate, if we're adding all those three red stacks on the different components, the aggregate impact could be of up to 18% of the total system cost. And again, this is a general system using our global average numbers, but essentially what you're thinking about as a developer or someone who's a system, or if you're in the integration business, you're really looking at how are you going to, I guess, pass on that additional cost, whatever it is, if it's 15, 20% onto the customer, and how that will directly impact your project development. And so that's kind of trying to an attempt to basically quantify the impact of the tariffs. And I think one of the questions that we get is essentially how will the tariffs, I guess, the impact of the tariffs change as the cost for batteries come down. So this is, let me go to the next slide. This slide here, a lot of you may have seen already. So this triangle, but specifically at our global averages for lithium-ion battery pack prices historically between 2010 and 2018. So historically, we've seen a massive trend downwards. This is not a new story for most of you guys. 85% drop in prices since 2010. Volume weighted in 2018, we saw battery pack prices globally at about $176 per kilowatt hour. That is a broad industry average, so that includes volume weighted average between electric vehicles and stationary storage, where the majority of the volume is in EVs. And then just to make a comment in terms of our cost forward, essentially when we're looking at how prices will come down over time, we're essentially extrapolating based on the learning rates in the past. So how much have battery prices have come down as a function of volume historically, and it's been about 18% drop in prices, every doubling in cumulative demand. And that's kind of how we're projecting our costs forward. So we're expecting prices to fall by about 8% to 15% annually over the coming couple of years. But again, this is a volume-weighted average, and the next slide is basically to contextualize the fact that passenger EV batteries are cheaper than stationary storage lithium-ion batteries, and by quite a margin. And so the reason for this is essentially volume, in terms of the volumes gained, and in terms of where the passenger EV demand is. We're talking about a sector that's about 10 times the stationary storage industry today. And then when we talk about supply agreements, we're talking about large orders in the automotive sector versus stationary storage, which typically there might be some agreements from between developers and battery manufacturers, or battery manufacturers and integrators, but generally you can be looking at an environment where you're doing a project by project basis, which is different to what you might see in the EV sector. And just to contextualize Chinese batteries specifically, so this slide here, what it shows is essentially the 2018 global average for pack prices in the U.S. is the green dotted line there, $227 per kilowatt hour. And then the blue dots and the and the yellow dotted line show basically the awarded prices for LFP racks in stationary storage projects in China. So LFP projects in China are basically being awarded at a 30% discount to our global average. And so I guess what this shows is, and this is of course looking at specifically systems being supplied to the Chinese market, and it's not the U.S. market, but essentially you do see that there is this markup and this premium, I guess, of the systems being deployed globally, and that's also true for the U.S. So I think the reason why it's relevant to think about China in terms of supply is because if you look at kind of costs and advantages on your own supply chain, you're probably looking at China's potential way to reduce your overall system costs. And so on to the next portion of the presentation. I did want to spend some time contextualizing like what's going on in the automotive sector and why China matters overall in the supply chain. So on the kind of total battery demand perspective, what we're talking about in terms of total annual demand for batteries between historically in 2016 through to 2030 is essentially the growth of battery demand, or the bulk of the growth is going to happen and is happening in the passenger EV segment. Here we stacked annual demand for batteries for passenger EVs, commercial EVs in yellow, stationary storage, which is our sector, in pink, which is a much smaller portion of the total, consumer electronics, which as of last year, passenger EV demand for batteries surpassed that for consumer electronics, and then e-buses, which is a smaller sliver of the total. So lithium-ion batteries for stationary storage, if we were to assume all the demand for batteries in stationary storage was lithium-ion, that would account for about 7% of 2030 battery demand. And this is important because if you're thinking about manufacturing capacity, which is essentially this slide here, we're looking at batteries and battery manufacturing capacity really ramping up, not really for our segments, but really for passenger EVs and for EVs generally. And what this chart shows here is every bubble represents a factory, a lithium-ion cell battery manufacturing facility globally. And you can see that there are many, many bubbles in Asia, some bubbles around Europe, and a few bubbles around the US. And so when we're kind of quantifying that at an aggregate scale, this is what you get to the chart on the left, which is current manufacturing capacity by plant location. So China owns, or China has the majority of the capacity today, about I guess 3/4 of total manufacturing capacity is located in China today. And that, I guess, in terms of the mix, will change from now through to 2025. So it goes down to about 2/3 of total capacity by 2025. And basically, the manufacturing capacity will triple in this period. The U.S. share kind of continues to be similar. Most of the capacity will be from Tesla expanding its facility, SK Innovation, I guess, citing its facility here in the U.S. But what's interesting is the presence of other manufacturing hubs in this period, including Europe in that mix. So China is a big portion of this pie, and probably not going to stop being relevant, but I guess the mix will change. I think what's interesting is to understand that the presence of the U.S. is not really changing that much as a ratio of the total. And just to talk to the kind of the near-term impacts on the current factories in the U.S. So the major manufacturers in the U.S. today is Tesla. So they're ramping up their gigafactory up to, well, their plans is to achieve 105 gigawatt hours, ramping up from about 35 gigawatt hours. So those would technically be, I guess, a portion of that capacity would technically be available for stationary storage. But I think it's kind of important to contextualize that even Tesla is not immune from the tariffs. So, and is not immune from the global supply chain. So just to put a quote from the latest earnings call, what Elon Musk was saying last year, in order to have enough sales for Model 3, Tesla actually had to convert all the lines of the Gigafactory to produce cells just for the Model 3, as opposed to Powerwall and Powerpack. And so they were essentially scrounging cells from around the world to at least continue some level of production of the Powerwall and Powerpack. So about 5 to 10% of the cells is what they're expecting to allocate from the Gigafactory for stationary storage. And so if they're really scrounging for cells globally, that also means that they're probably importing cells from China or from other locations. And so they're not the only ones who necessarily won't be impacted by the tariffs. And I guess this is kind of to show that, again, the priority really is EVs. So that's a picture of the Model 3. Another example there is LG Chem. They have their factory in Holland, Michigan. That factory is mainly supplying the Chevy Bolt, or the Chevy electrified transport vehicles, including the Bolt. They have a capacity of much smaller than the Tesla Gigafactory of about 3 gigawatt hours. And then the other one that was recently announced was the SK Innovation, which has a planned capacity of 9.8 gigawatt hours, which is mainly, I guess, focused on providing cells to the VW electric cars over the coming years. So again, the push for manufacturing capacity in the U.S. is very much focused on the EV market. I think in parallel, what's been happening, and what this chart here shows is essentially these are the Chinese storage equipment suppliers and the value chain in China. And what we're really seeing in China is essentially there's a quite a robust, in a lot of ways, value chain there, mainly focused on the Chinese market, but a lot of the battery makers on the battery on this battery column here are looking for opportunities to supply cells to the global market, and not just the battery makers, but also PCS manufacturers and vertically integrated companies are starting to look abroad being the U.S., but also including other markets like Europe as well. So I think it's not just U.S. companies or U.S.-based companies or companies who are deploying systems in the U.S. going to China looking for opportunities to integrate lower-cost systems, but also Chinese companies looking into the U.S. market to expand its overall presence globally. And I think the last thing that I'll present before the conclusion is essentially when we were looking at the volume-weighted average of lithium-ion battery pack prices by region delivered. So this is the end of 2018 data. What we actually saw is that the U.S. on average, so the blue bars in these charts, had a slightly lower average than the Chinese average. Actually, that's a lot related to the weight of the Tesla battery pack prices and their publicly announced prices, impacting the overall kind of system or the overall pack prices in the U.S. And you can see kind of the range being much bigger for the higher system costs or the higher battery pack prices in the U.S. versus China, where the lower range is lower than the U.S. But essentially, I guess Korea is kind of in this middle ground, and also kind of an interesting story to kind of think about where the supply chain might evolve as the tariffs might be imposed. So with that in mind, I guess I'll kind of conclude with this slide here, which is just to talk about some of the specific impacts on U.S. storage market. It's a work in progress, so bear with me. So the first thing is obviously if the tariffs do go through, we're going to see increased costs. That's pretty clear. As a system integrator, you're looking at how you're going to pass on those costs to the customer, and or how you might be squeezing your margins from the battery provider or from the system sold. On the second point, there's definitely kind of supply chain re-strategizing, so integration of storage systems in other countries and investigating if that would be a cost-effective mechanism to circumvent tariffs, looking at rule of origin, and this might be the companies that have a nimble supply chain. There's definitely a lot of uncertainty of the tariffs and an uncertain environment for the long-term strategy and the supply chain. So because we don't know for how long these tariffs will be sustained, it's kind of hard to make a big investment decision on how to move the supply chain, because that will probably entail a big investment in any case. And then on the last point, the impact on U.S. deployments, at least at this stage, it's clear that near-term contracts that have not yet signed a battery supply agreement may need to be renegotiated if they were assuming battery prices, or they were not assuming the tariffs were going to be hit. We're going to hit lithium-ion batteries, or margins will be slimmed down. And I think those are kind of the three big macro points. There's probably a lot of details on how each one of these probably impact you specifically, but that's kind of it from me for now. I'm basically welcoming input to this research. Please do reach out to me. There's a lot I think that's going to come. I'm hoping to expand on this research and publish a report in the coming couple of weeks. So definitely, I do welcome some comments there, and that's my email. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, that was really interesting. And we have quite a lot of Q&A coming through here, but a reminder that folks can submit questions via the chat box down the bottom left of your screen. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative here and start off with a question of my own. If a company manufactures battery cells in China and then sends them to a different third country for assembly into battery packs or even a full containerized assembly with inverters and whatnot before shipping them to the U.S., would those be counted as an import from that other country, or would they be as an import from China, or would there be some kind of prorating of the value of the product? I mean, what are the rules around that kind of sort of, that kind of assembly of components into something that then gets imported? And how would customs view that? John, maybe would that be for you?
I think I can probably field that one, yeah. So the 301 tariffs apply to imports of products that are considered for general customs purposes to be products of China. Every imported product comes in with an entry summary where the country of origin is identified. And typically the country of origin of a product that we import is considered to be the last place where it was substantially transformed. Whether or not the particular scenario that you described would be considered to be a substantial transformation in the third country and confer origin in that third country, I don't know, but likely there are some customs precedents that apply to different permutations of what folks do with these products, and it wouldn't be all that hard to look up and see. But if the general rule is that if you do something in a third country that creates a new or different article of commerce, then that's a substantial and origin conferring transformation. And so if that happened, say, in India, then the imported product would be considered to be a product of India, and the Chinese content would not be at all relevant in terms of whether, the 301 tariffs just wouldn't apply because it wouldn't be a product of China when it hits our shores.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thanks. All right. We had a couple of questions asking about whether also tariffs on sort of other components that we'd all be thinking about in an energy storage project. For example, power electronics, inverters, charge controllers, and such that are part of battery systems. Either Yayoi or John?
Can you repeat that question? I'm sorry.
Are there also any tariffs that apply to things like power electronics, inverters, charge controllers, and such?
Yeah, so the PCS, so under the previous, I think it's list 3.
List 3.
Yeah, there was static converters, so that would apply to the PCS component that comes from China. And other components, I talked about the metals piece, but I guess that's not necessarily directly useful for the audience. But I guess there are other components that could apply, like containers if they're from China, for example.
This, John, I haven't checked on all of these, but one that really did attract some notice on list 3 was inverters.
Right. So they have a tariff applied to that as well.
Those are currently hovering at 10%, but liable at any time to leap to 25% if the negotiations don't turn in a better direction.
Gotcha. Thanks. We had a few questions related to where and when on the supply chain tariffs are applied. So who pays them and when? One person said that they see them on their quotes, but it's not transparent where in the process they're applied.
So I sent in the chat space, I sent replies to a couple of the folks who had these questions. This is John. The legal liability for U.S. tariffs of all sorts, including these 301 tariffs, lands on the importer of record. There is, however, nothing in Section 301 that precludes a foreign vendor from absorbing that cost and basically just cutting the price in an amount equal to the tariff. So economically speaking, it doesn't have to be borne by the U.S. importer or by the U.S. importer's own customers inside the United States. But from a legal point of view, it lands on the importer, and it's a percentage of the declared customs value of the goods being imported.
All right, thank you. Perhaps for Yayoi, do we have a sense of how much the current share of grid scale storage systems in the U.S. Are made with Chinese components?
Yeah, I was trying to quantify that a couple of weeks back and then realized, well, actually, so if you look at kind of 2018 and historically between 2016 and 2018, the share of who's a major battery supplier to the U.S. in terms of systems, like it's basically about, I would say almost two-thirds Korean battery suppliers, and there's Tesla with a big share, and then there's a lot of unknowns, but a lot of which is probably being sourced from China. On the Korean front, it's essentially, I think the interesting dynamic is, although LG Chem and Samsung SDI are major suppliers to the U.S. market, and they're Korean, they might be sourcing basically their batteries from their Chinese facilities, so those themselves would be impacted by the tariffs. So a big portion, about two-thirds, depending on the presence of kind of Korean and Chinese.
Mm-hmm. The next one, I think for John, would items that are produced, developed, and manufactured in the U.S. but sent to China to be packaged without the exchange of IP be subject to tariffs?
Am I on mute? No, I'm not. So again, if what happens in China is not an origin conferring process, and when it comes back, it doesn't have to be imported because it isn't, it's still a product of the United States, then it would not be covered by tariffs. But that provision in the U.S. tariff code is being scrutinized and applied very sort of grudgingly by customs in the administration of the 301 measure.
Thanks.
So normally just packaging a product would not be considered as something that substantially transforms it and confers origin.
Would that maybe depend what we mean by package? I mean, if that cell's being put into a shipping container or other sort of final product for installation, that presumably would, yeah?
I see a closely related question in the queue as well, which is if something is substantially transformed, does that mean that it gets a new HTS number? So oftentimes in deciding whether a process like that does or does not substantially transform an item and confer origin, one of the things that customs will look to is whether the tariff classification changes at a meaningful digit. So something that caused a change in classification, at the 10 or 8-digit level, maybe not. Something that caused a change in classification at the 6 or 4-digit level, probably so.
Okay. So there's a related question that we have here. Is the term substantial transformation classified as cost added or proprietary aspects added? Does that play at all into that number change?
So substantial transformation is one of these, more than a century-old concepts in trade law. And it's been defined in the U.S. courts, this goes back many decades, as something that creates a new or different article of commerce. And sometimes the application of that concept is exceedingly difficult. And countries disagree about whether particular kinds of processes are substantial transformations. An example of that would be as simple as, in the solar world, whether assembling solar cells into a module substantially transforms them and confers origin. But there's a million examples, and so with respect to that question, if a lot of value is being added, if proprietary technology is being inserted in some way, then in all likelihood you'd be talking about a process that would be regarded as a substantial transformation and would confer origin.
Great, thanks. We have a question. If the product is leased from China, would it be charged tariffs?
This is John again. I think the normal rule on that is that stuff that comes in pursuant to a lease for less than a year is considered to be a temporary import and is treated distinctively for that reason. And if it's a more than 1 year lease, then it's treated as an import, even if ownership hasn't changed hands.
Right, thanks. For Yayoi, when thinking about transitioning manufacturing to another country, are there particular countries that are more favorable than others? Is this going to drive energy storage or other product development in particular countries, do you think? Are you seeing other particular sites where this is likely to transfer to?
Yeah, so I think when we're thinking about cell manufacturing, that's a harder one because, again, as I was talking, it's really dependent on demand, mainly from EVs. So, I mean, we see a push in Europe and definitely a commitment from the European governments to basically support a European manufacturing base. There's obviously the LG Chems and SKs who are going to Europe and citing their factories there. In the U.S., there really isn't that kind of push. We're looking more specifically to do analysis on the costs and assumption. I guess basically look at how much it would cost for manufacturing in different countries, and kind of depends on many different inputs. And currently, obviously in China, the total costs are lower than manufacturing in the U.S., but then you have to kind of make specific site assumptions, which you could make, and technology assumptions. I think it's possible, but again, I think any kind of commitment towards cell manufacturing would essentially be justified from an EV perspective, like stationary storage. From a total industry perspective, it's not sufficient to justify cell manufacturing in the U.S. And the dynamics in the U.S. specifically for EVs are less strong than the ones that we currently see in Europe. I don't know if that is helpful, but to contextualize that.
Thanks so much. We've got a huge number of questions coming in as the clock runs out. Very quickly, last question here. We have someone asking, how do we block or get exemption to tariffs? He says this should be the focus of the discussion. So what is there for the companies on the call to do at this point? Either of you.
This is John. I'll take a first swipe at that. So there is a public comment process going on right now with respect to the items that are proposed to be hit on List 4. And I would say, sort of from a process standpoint, this is the best, cleanest moment of opportunity to try to persuade the administration that hitting lithium-ion batteries in particular is not a good idea. It probably will be the case that later on that there is an opportunity to get to apply for exemption at the 10-digit level for certain very specific kinds of lithium-ion batteries, either EV or other types. But the focus from a practical point of view really ought to be on trying to persuade them just to not hit lithium-ion batteries at the 8-digit level in the first place. So that would include participating in the public notice and comment process where you have a comment deadline on June 10th, participating in the public hearing, and then also gathering with as much force as you can, everybody who is going to be negatively affected if this item is hit, and getting strong intervention from Capitol Hill to try to persuade the administration. There's going to be a much broader pushback and concerns expressed about lots of things on List 4. List 4 hits an awful lot of consumer-ready products that with tariffs that will land on vulnerable consumers. We're now getting to the point where we're hitting, apparel and footwear and other stuff from China. So there's going to be a big debate about List 4. But if there are folks in the who are using Chinese goods as manufacturing inputs, and whose competitiveness is going to be seriously put at risk by hitting an item like lithium-ion batteries, then that's a different story, and one that needs to be told both through the public comment channel, but also through just regular old lobbying activity in Washington.
And where can folks find out more about public comments if they want to submit any?
So the invitation for public comment was put out through a Federal Register notice from the USTR. If it's helpful, I can send you, Tom, the link for that, and you can fan it out to everybody who participated today in the webinar. And it has a procedure. The public notice and comment process runs through a website called regulations.gov.
Sure.
And it's not the most user-friendly thing in the world, but with a little bit of sustained effort, one can figure it out. But there's an opportunity there to submit comments either that are completely public, or if your comment requires you to have reference to some proprietary data, then you can redact that and submit sort of a confidential version and a public version of your comment. And I think that the deadline for asking to be heard at the public hearing is the same June 10th deadline. I haven't double-checked that, but there is a cutoff coming up fairly soon for requesting to be on the list of witnesses at that public hearing later in June.
Great. Excellent. Well, very sorry to all those who asked questions we weren't able to get to. Fantastic attendance on this webinar, and obviously you all are very engaged with this important issue. With that, I'd like to draw things to a close. Thank you so much to our two speakers, John Magnus and Yayoi Sakine. That was incredibly interesting, incredibly useful. And thanks to all of those of you who connected up this afternoon to hear about it. Hope to have you on future webinars. And one last pitch to save the date for our ESA Storage Exchange in October in Washington State. And with that, thank you very much, and hope you can fill out the feedback form, which should pop up as you exit this webinar. Thank you to everyone, and have a great afternoon. Goodbye.